it's one of the questions that I have of how do we understand the resurrection? What is the meaning of?
Yes, well, this is cutting right into the whole meaning of life. The way I understand it is, I would give the example of for example, you might have thousands of flowers that have faded, but if you're able to extract the perfume from them, that perfume is going to live forever. Now, I cannot imagine that the experience that man accumulates on Earth, or an individual person accumulates on Earth, should be lost. The programming of everything in the universe is so intelligent. You cannot imagine that anything that is valuable could possibly be lost. And therefore, the way I understand it is that the experience or the know-how or the realization that is accumulated by a person on Earth is carried, how can I say, upwards, let us say, in the return journey. And in order to do so, of course, one has to free oneself of the contingent aspect of the experience and only retain the know-how that is gained from it. And even getting more and more subtle. Imagine, for example, a doctor having died, the actual details of his practice are not useful to him anymore. But the wisdom that he's gathered through dealing with human bodies, for example, represents a reality which may, as I say, contribute towards the overall, how can I say, realization of the consciousness of the universe. Mm-hmm. What I'm really saying here is that God is both dynamic and static. That one mustn't think of archetypes, which static archetypes like the Eidos of Plato that remain there permanently, and everything is just simply reflecting these archetypes. The programming is totally spontaneous and inventive and creative, just like a Toccata and Fugue Bach, for example. And in that sense, one can say that evolution is a departure from the norm. It's always exploring new possibilities. Hazrat Anand Khan used to say that think of God rather as an artist who imagines a painting before he makes a painting, but once he starts it, he changes his programming because he finds new ways of doing it better than he had thought before. So you mustn't think that things are preordained. But this cuts right into life, because you see in the traditions, well, in the way the teaching of the Buddhists and sometimes of the Hindus is given, it's generally assumed that that which we're experiencing on life is transient and therefore has no value, and one should liberate oneself from it. In that case, of course, that life would make sense. There would be no purpose in existence. The only sense that life can make is if it contributes towards the well-being of the whole. And therefore, there must be a process whereby, let's say, the experience of a human being is digested by the total consciousness.
Uh-huh. Your metaphor of God being a painter, then we would be the paint or the canvas.
No. We're also part of the painter. That's the beauty, is that we're not just manipulated by an action beyond ourselves, but you see, according to the Sufis, God wished that every fraction of himself should be endowed with the qualities or the faculties that he enjoys in the totality. And therefore, that includes his consciousness. Maybe today one should say his and her consciousness. Uh-huh. I don't know. You see, the language has been formed by our ancestors who were chauvinists. And so we're still using the same language, which doesn't fit into our present way of thinking. So I have to excuse myself every time I say him, but I think people understand what I mean.
I remind myself now, when I say my prayers, I say his, her, to remind myself, because it feels like an internal state of mind to, the patriarchy is in my head, in my thinking, and I want to bring myself through that into a more balanced state.
I think that we have to do all that. It's our home lessons that we have to, homework that we have to go through. Yes.
Right. Excuse me.
Yes. What I was saying is that we, in as much as one can speak of individuals, and I would say, I'm talking rather in terms of Buddhism now, I think individuality is a very relative term. If we could, for example, if we could look at everything from the divine point of view, it would, I think the whole people would look like the cells of God's body, like he would see, be observing his own body, and what we think are separate human beings would look like just the cells of this one body. But it's just because we're looking at things from a personal vantage point that we assume that another person has a very special identity. And I think that is true too. I think both are true. So in one sense, the totality is indivisible. It's all one reality, and and that is from a certain vantage point, it is indivisible. And from another vantage point, it seems like there's a lot of autonomy in the parts. But curiously enough, every part contains a totality. That's why the universe is a hologram.
Yes.
These are the new views. And that would mean that everyone carries within himself the totality of the divine inheritance. And that's what Christ said when he said, "Be ye perfect as your Father." And as you know, the DNA of every cell of the body contains not only the code of the whole body, but contains the code of the universe. So that we seem, in one way, to be a fraction of the totality, and on the other hand, we are potentially the totality.
Would this apply to other parts of the universe? In other words, could we imagine if we are a hologram of the whole universe, that if we were to make contact with beings on in some other part of the universe, that they would be recognizable, or they would be a different hologram?
It means, no. You could say, of course, a lot of holograms within holograms, but the point is that what this really means is that we are like a pyramid or a cone, if you like, and we're not just the apex of the cone in which the whole universe has converged, but a point does not have any volume, as you know, and so the apex really is extended into the whole cone. And so one aspect of ourselves is like what we think our individuality is, and the other aspect is the totality. And that means that we carry within us the inheritance of all beings. And that's not only our parents and ancestors, and as you know, I counted once, calculate the amount of ancestors we had at the time of Moses. Imagine a generation to be something like 25 years. It's incredible. I forget now the numbers, but we had more ancestors than there were people on the planet at that time. So what I'm saying is that we inherit more people from more people and more beings than we could ever imagine. In fact, we are the totality of the past that continues to live. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when I say we inherit, we are that inheritance. We're not like a capacity that contains an inheritance, we are that inheritance. Mm-hmm. And not only do we inherit from our physical ancestors, but also from our angelic ancestors and archangelic ancestors and so on. And
help me understand that. How do we inherit from our angelic ancestors?
Well, I'll tell you a little story. It's maybe it's a little comic. Imagine that having died, you continued to live as what should I say, as an angel, and then that means you didn't have a body, but you were a being of light, for example, and you came in touch with another angel, and you fell in love, and you created another little baby angel, right? And having done so, this little baby angel is incarnated on Earth, and you die as an angel and survive as a seraphim, for example, and so then part of you has moved upwards and part of you has moved downwards.
Ah.
Does that explain reincarnation? because you thought that you remembered a previous life, and indeed that was that person who became an angel, and then that person, that angel has had a progeny of a baby angel who's become a mortal again.
So in a way, what I just saw was the DNA spiral, which goes clockwise up and counterclockwise down. So within, that's like a physical manifestation of that two directions of movement, upwards and down.
We have a DNA in our soul too. I mean, the physical DNA is only one of several DNAs. There was a wonderful definition of the DNA is, of course, a code, isn't it? It's really a seed. That's the meaning of a seed. And David Bohm, Dr. David Bohm, he's a physicist, a professor of physics at Berkeley College in London, and rather very remarkable mind. And he said that he thought that the seed was, really speaking, it's an intelligence and an energy that organizes the environment in order to fulfill his own sense of a purpose. I think that's a very wonderful definition of what we are, essentially. That's what we are. But there's a third factor. We are energy, life, energy, and intelligence or consciousness. But we're also, and there's a third factor, and that is ecstasy. Right? And that's the one thing that scientists won't go along with. Carl Pribben said, I can go along with the two first factors, but the third one, I don't really understand what you mean. But it is the power that moves the universe, is ecstasy. And that's the meaning of Sat Chit Ananda. Sat means, as you know, energy. Well, it means matter, but it also means spirit, because energy and matter is the same. And then Chit is generally translated by mind, but it really means, let's say, consciousness, intelligence, and Ananda, of course, means is translated by joy, cosmic joy. Behind the whole universe is jubilation, is a cosmic celebration.
Now, is it necessary for scientists to deny themselves ecstasy in order to really understand matter in their way?
No, I think that they peer into the intelligence behind the universe. You know, that's the miracle of life, is not only that we participate in the nature of matter in our bodies. Isn't that extraordinary, that we participate in the fabric of the universe? But we also have access into the thinking behind the universe. For example, what does a flower know of the motion of a star? That the human being is able to understand something of the laws, the harmonies of the heavens governing the motion of the stars. That's an indication of the tremendous privilege that we have to have access into the programming behind. And what is more, when we do that, we realize that we are part of that programming ourselves.
Yes.
We're not manipulated by it, but we also participate in it.
Tell me, now Voyager is out there collecting more data than we've ever had about the stars and the universe and the heavens, more than we can collate and understand. And at the same time, there's and they want to stop funds to put into the understanding of all of that information. Does that seem wise to you, to limit our investigation of the heavens?
Well, first of all, you know that one gets the answers in proportion to the way one asks the questions. You limit nature's answer by the way you ask its questions. And as you mentioned quite rightly, the scientist is asking many questions which he, of whose relevance he doesn't know, but he's just has to shoot out these questions just in case there should be an appropriate answer. So maybe there's an overabundance, let's say, of questions there and of apparatus that perhaps were not quite as necessary. But you know, a lot of scientists say that they may be seeking for a certain to investigate a certain aspect of nature, and in the course of their investigation they discover something totally different from what they had hoped to discover. Now, your question about the funds, I'm not very aware of economics. It's not my field, and I think it would be foolhardy to speak about things that I'm not an expert in. Everybody's expressing opinions about things that they don't know, and I try to avoid it as much as I can. But of course I realize that in the minds of the statesmen there are other issues, like, for example, hunger in the world today. I hope that is one of the issues.
That's my question. Thank you. How do we balance our yearning to understand the heavens with our responsibility to feed the people on the planet?
Well, there is some connection between the two. You know that, of course, the material well-being of our civilizations is at present is largely due to the tremendous advances in technology and science. On the other hand, it's questionable whether that is a real well-being anyway. It is possible that people were happier before when they didn't have TV sets and so on, but we can't set back time anymore. Also, the result of that has been a proliferation of society which would have been curtailed in any case by epidemics and all kinds of things, the natural laws of the ecological laws of the planet. So from the moment that the human being starts intervening in the overall laws that govern the planet, then of course one creates new situations where there's maybe some advantages and a lot of disadvantages. But we can't turn the clock back, so that's the way things are at present. And so from the moment that you start intervening, then of course you have to go all the way. So it means that the destinies of the planet is much more in the hands of man, or let's say that part of God that is man, then God, let's say, irrespective of the intervention of man, let's say. And so from that moment, then of course there's a problem in apportioning exactly which part is going to be given towards hunger and which is going to be given towards alleviating hunger or towards defense or towards this research. And what that proportion is can only be arbitrary. And you know, sometimes I'm faced with a very cruel argument, and that is that sheer proliferation in numbers is not necessarily an advantage. The way that evolution proceeds is sometimes by a quantum leap from one state to the next. One doesn't increase the well-being of the universe by increasing the number of people.
Yes.
And normally nature took care of that by limiting people in a very cruel way. Nature is very cruel.
Is there some basic truth that's in all of the religions that you found, that's in Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and Judaism, that's one thing that can be found everywhere? One teaching?
Well, of course. I would say that's the very object of my quest, of my life's quest, is to discover what I like to call complementarity instead of contradictions. There is no doubt that there is sometimes a dichotomy between those, how can I say, those endeavors which lead a person to retire from the world because they feel that it's an illusion, and experience liberation. But for example, amongst the Sufis, there's a saying of Fariduddin Attar who says, renounce the world, renounce yourself, and then renounce renunciation out of love. So it is possible that to start with, one feels caught up in all the sham and the dishonesty and the violence, And there may be times that one is burnt out to the extent that one feels that one can't cope with all of this and needs to retire into a peaceful condition in oneself. Even the trees return to, all the energy of the trees return to right down to the roots in the winter. But then there's a time to renounce renunciation out of love. Otherwise, I would say that liberation is the height of egotism. Now, the clue behind all of this is because, you see, in the so-called revealed religions, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's an accent on two things. One is on the importance of what is achieved in life. In Christianity, it's incarnation. And secondly, on resurrection. That means that all that is achieved is not lost. It is incorporated back into, fed back into the totality. So that it is, whereas in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, very often it is considered to be transient and therefore perishable and therefore not that important. Now, I'm generalizing because I remember asking this question to the Dalai Lama. You see, we organize every year a congress in Paris, an inter-religious congress. We invite people of different faiths, and one of our themes was reincarnation and resurrection. And it was quite typical. The Hindus and Buddhists spoke about reincarnation, and the Christians and Jews and Muslims spoke about resurrection. And so I was trying to dig as deeply as I could into Buddhist thought to see if there was any place for resurrection in Buddhism. Whether indeed, and what I meant by resurrection is not resurgence, but or revival or whatever, but it was this idea that that which has been gained in life is, as I say, essentialized, is turned into, sublimated, let's say, turned into an essence which accrues to the totality. And I didn't have a satisfactory answer, but when I met the Dalai Lama I met him several times. The last time was in New York. I asked him just precisely that question. And he said, indeed, there is a rather secret teaching of the Buddhists, according to which, indeed, that which is transient is, however, eternalized. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Incarnation is a motion from the eternal state into the process of becoming. And so in the process of becoming, one unfolds that which is eternally in one already, as a latency, as a potentiality. And in the return, somehow the eternal archetypes are enriched by what has accrued to one by the interrelationship between this part of God and that part of God, having interfaced one another, something is gained.
And what is it? Why are we doing all of this?
I think there's a tremendous joy and fulfillment in enriching more and more, finding new ways of doing things better, and all the joy and the breakthrough of understanding that comes through. Yeah, it's, I think, the same kind of experience that a composer feels, discovering new ways of expressing the inexpressible. It's all, I would say, it's like what the poet calls the impossible possibility, that infinity should be present in a finite fact and eternity in a temporal act. It's drawing the potential richness that is just simply dormant into actuation, making it actualized, making it real. And also through this, the interconnectiveness between the parts of the whole enrich the whole.
And in our individual lives, how do we come to know what is required of us as souls individually?
Well, I think that most people are motivated by an innate need to unfold the potentialities in the being. First of all, we have a kind of inbuilt, inherent sense of perfection. It was Poincaré who said man is endowed with the propensities of eternity and infinity. For example, you can always imagine an earlier time in history or a later time in history than the earliest or latest time that you've imagined so far, or a further point in space. And so in the same way, you can always imagine a greater perfection than the greatest perfection that you have imagined so far. So somehow it's built in the human being. And one is always aware of having fallen short, of having fulfilled that need. I would say this is the basic drive of life. And every time that one observes oneself, the nitty-gritty, let's say, what has one actually actuated in one's being out of that ideal that motivates one, one is, of course, disappointed. And sometimes people say, well, isn't it selfish to try and become, improve yourselves? Not at all. You are simply enacting the whole purpose of life that's behind you, the whole forward march of evolution. So that's what motivates us, unfolding the potentialities in our being. Now, in order to do so, sometimes action is the ideal means, because one is challenging the potentialities of one being into actuation by trying to overcome problems or trying to build something or be creative. So it's very important to be creative. It's a way of actuating the potentialities of one's being and therefore unfolding. Mm-hmm. I think the other element is realization. Man is invited, as I say, to participate in the divine consciousness. And his consciousness is part of the divine consciousness, but one has funneled oneself right down into one's personal vantage point, and one is called upon to be able to have insight into this overall overview over a sense of meaningfulness. And of course you know that our personal vantage point is like a lens, let's say, but it is adumbrated by a kind of a overall cosmic consciousness. For example, there are moments when you feel that you're just part of nature. For example, you're sitting in nature and you feel that the frontiers between your being and the environment have petered out, and you're just flowing in with the universe, and the universe is flowing in you. Or, for example, imagine St. Francis walking in the forest and getting right into the consciousness of the trees and the plants and flowers and the birds and the animals, whereas most people just all they see is the bark of the tree. And you haven't seen a tree if you just see the bark of the tree. And so somehow beyond this very limited vantage point of the human being, there's a whole area of consciousness which Maslow calls, well, when you reach that you have what they call a peak experience, or an alternate state of consciousness. And in the same way, one also has the ability sometimes to look, to have an overview of oneself, to observe oneself as though one were another person, for example.
Yes.
And then one thinks, what am I doing down here? And how is it possible that I let myself be caught into this little vantage point? And how is it possible that I allowed myself to be so concerned about my little storms in my teacups, when in fact I've missed the great show in the universe, that's what I call the cosmic celebration.
Yeah.
I think that's what we are invited to. And if we fail to do it, we sink into terrible despair, and that's what's happening to a lot of people.
Yes. Now, why is that happening? Why have so many people lost contact with that meaningfulness of life that you spoke of?
Well, we are conditioned. We're conditioned to a much larger extent than we think. Our thinking is geared to material gain, to the needs of society and warfare and all those things. I think that it is a function of religion to remind one, that's the meaning of mnemosis in Greek, you know, to remind one of what one is. And somehow one has let oneself be caught in a vantage point.
The function of religion is to remind oneself of what one is. That's very beautiful.
Well, may I ask you questions now?
Yes. Yes.
You see, I have a feeling that you embody, in your role in life, you embody the hopes and fears and concerns of a lot of people. And quite rightly, one says that a person in the public view, or let us say a public figure, as one says, becomes a kind of archetype. What that means, I understand that what that means is that one becomes more and more impersonal in a sense, in that one incorporates the feelings and the aspirations and the fears, as I say, of more and more people. On the other hand, in order to incorporate them, one has to be able to personalize them, and therefore, on one hand, one becomes more archetypal, let's say, than most people, and on the other hand, one becomes even more of a person at the same time. And it's, of course, the relating of these two things that, of course, is very challenging, and I'm sure that you must feel that challenge sometimes. Yes. And what I think is that when one is in this situation, one tends to get caught up in the image that you have, first of all, created, and now it's boomerang back to you. People throw it back to you, and one has to have a lot of courage to explode this image in order to, first of all, to be free, to be able to affirm what is coming through one, because I don't think that one should simply reflect the hopes and aspirations of people. I think that one also has to transmit a message, to be a path blazer, to open up new horizons to people, and therefore one has to be creative in the real sense, just like a musician is, or an artist. I think that what the artist does and the musician does and the poet does is to plug in to the thinking of the universe. And the thinking of the universe, as I say, is always new and inventive. And so one is trying to translate through whatever language one is using, whether it's music or language or art or drama, for example, a kind of fresh impulse, a kind of new way of looking at things which has never been looked exactly upon that way. You know, when I look at the toccatas and fugues of Bach or some of his inventions, it's clear to me that he's seeking new ways of doing what he's done each time that he's done before. And so you can't just reflect as I say, the hopes and fears of people, but you must also be molding the thinking of people and their emotions by infusing into them something of a much wider nature than that which they have got themselves confined to. And therefore you're opening them up to something which is very important for them.
Well, the process of acting is also, it involves opening me up. When I was studying healing for my work on resurrection, and I came across the idea of being a channel of higher energy, which is what the woman who taught me how to use my hands said, that she felt that she was a channel. It connected in my mind with the experience I've had, not frequently, but sometimes, in acting, where I feel that I always feel like I'm operating from a base of ignorance, where I really don't know anything. And
well, that's how we all feel.
and I start out thinking I'm not going to be able to do this job at hand, and I don't know how to do it. And then I begin, and I find one little thing I could do, one little task I could try and complete in this scene, and then something else comes, and something else comes, and pretty soon there's a scene taking place that I'm taking part in that I couldn't have really have thought about ahead of time. I couldn't have come to this ahead of time, but as the process develops, now something is unfolding, and then occasionally there's another point that's reached where I'm quite surprised, and something else occurs that and I can feel the power of it going through me, literally, and expressing itself through me, and I have very little to do with it, and I always have the feeling of taking a ride on it.
Yes.
So I don't think of myself as actually being able to mold anyone's thinking or to influence other people, because I know that I'm too ignorant to do that. But that I've learned how to do my work in such a way that sometimes I'm surprised, and then I feel very blessed.
Yes, well, you confirmed something that I felt. I think the first time I saw you, it was in Chamonix.
Yes.
And, you know, I have a habit of, or a practice of doing what they call darshan, which is really looking into the soul of the person and seeing what... it's not character reading so much as seeing that which is on the way towards manifestation, those qualities that are on the way. In fact, how the person could be if they would be what they should be. Now, generally what the next step is. And I remember seeing that you had a contribution to make in the realm of healing. And I've felt that, of course, all along, more so lately than even in the beginning. I saw something about the past incarnations, and it's only important in as much as it has relevance to what one is doing now, and sometimes it does have. But you know, I'll tell you a story. There was a time when the son of the king in Turkey was dying, the prince was dying, and the king called for volunteers to heal him, and nobody was able to make any difference until they called Shams Tabriz. Now, Shams Tabriz was a far out, if I may say, dervish, living somewhere in nature like St. John the Baptist, and it was very difficult to find him, but he was, you know, those people who are living continually in the presence of God develop incredible power and incredible intuition, and particularly healing power, of course. Some of them become so powerful that people are afraid of coming anywhere near them because they look right into their soul with the power of truth. And some of them say, don't come anywhere near me because I'll burn you.
Uh-huh.
And here was Shams Tabriz, burning like a fire, radiant like a luminary. And he came in the palace, and he, using the orthodox formula, he said, Bismillah, that means in the name of God, stand up. Nothing happened. And then he said, in my name, stand up. And indeed the prince recovered. And then he was beaten to death because he had infringed and violated the laws upon, he had infringed upon and violated the laws of Islam. But quite rightly so. It sounds like a terrible claim, you know, to, instead of being humble and becoming the instrument of the divine power, to claim to have done it oneself. But if one looks deeper into it, one finds that when he said Bismillah in the name of God, he was still aware of himself as an individual. And when he said in my name, he had lost altogether his own personal consciousness. So what he didn't mean by me, the individual, it was God speaking in him.
Uh-huh.
Now, I don't know whether I'm making too big a leap from there into saying what I want to say here, but somehow one has to be both the instrument of the divine action and also be that action. How this is combined is very difficult to say. There's a saying of Ibn Arabi, the great metaphysician of the Sufis, who says that you are not derived from God, because if you say La ilaha illallah, that means it's all one being. And so they say, he goes on to say, the vehicle through which God manifests is also God. So it's when we're conscious of our personal selves, and we think of ourselves as a vehicle through which this consciousness comes, or this power, or whatever it is. I am the eyes through which God sees, for example, or I am the hands through which God heals, and so on. I want to become a pure instrument of the divine power of healing, and so on. That as long as one is still conscious of oneself, is the best thing one can do, of one's own person. But somehow we are also the divine glance, and we are not just only the vehicle of it, and we are also the divine power. We are not just a vehicle. Even the body is not just a vehicle, it's also pure spirit. So it's a great problem. It's to understand how far the divine will can be incorporated in individual wills, and how far how far individual wills have to toe the line, or how far they have a positive contribution to the divine will. It's a very difficult metaphysical question there. One could say that in one sense, when the human will becomes totally illuminated, it really does represent the divine will. But everything is the divine will, but the divine will gets, how can I say, watered down, or somehow disintegrated at the jagged ends. It's like a total being who, in all nature, of course, nature is always getting disintegrated at one end of the scale. On the other hand, nature is always rebuilding itself up in the center somehow, and at jagged ends it's disintegrating. And so the same thing in the human being. I always think of these words of John Sebastian Bach. He was describing his art, and he said, "The art of my science, the science of my art," he said, "nobody knows except me." He said, "I'm trying to build a social commonwealth, an example of the order of the stars to be used by man." He said, "It is not the imposition of one theme upon another other themes, but it is the interrelationship of all the themes together, limiting their prerogatives for the sake of the harmony of the whole, by imposing a certain self-discipline upon themselves, and yet still affirming their own particular contribution to the whole." I think that the most perfect model of the whole nature of life, the will of the individual being absolutely creative, and at the same time having to not toe the line, but somehow take into account the wills of other people, and on the whole, of course, the overall divine will.
It's always this balance between, the problem is always, like, for instance, a problem that I'm facing right at the moment this week is an experience I had with somebody I've been associated with for over 10 years professionally, who's been a friend, and I've been badly hurt by twice, and both times forgave him completely and trusted him. And now a third time it's happened again, and now I say, but wait, every day in one of my prayers, when I say the Lord's Prayer, and I say, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." So I must forgive him. At the same time, I must practice discretion in my own life so I don't go right back there with the same person again to hurt me for the fourth time. And so that balance of withdrawing the possibility for him to hurt me and at the same time totally forgiving him.
No, you can forgive a person. It doesn't mean, it doesn't follow that you have to trust the person because you forgive them. No. I think forgiving means that you consider that he was the instrument of programming beyond your understanding. Let's say he was a stick with which God nudged you. So you don't blame him. It's possible that he lended himself very well to that role, but then that's his business. Now, of course, it displaces the problem, and a lot of people have a grudge against God. Well, they say against destiny. Some people have the courage to say against God, but it's more polite to say against the blind hand of destiny. Now, of course, it's natural that one should have that grudge if one doesn't understand that everything is programmed. Now, I don't say that everything is preordained. There's a difference there.
Yes.
No, but that programming is perhaps more complex than we think, because it includes the wills of individuals. It's not like God up there with his will, and then there are people who try to either toe the line or then disregard the divine will. It's much more complex than that. It's like an integrated will, in multiple will in a sense, and somehow there's coordination at the center and a certain amount of lack of order or entropy at the jagged ends. I suppose it may be, the best example of it may be a symphony where some people are in tune and more or less in tune, and other people are really out of tune. So it's more like a mixture of a cacophony and a symphony. That's probably a better example of the way things are. It's very difficult to think that way, but it's it's beyond our understanding. But then reality is beyond our understanding.
So then God has written a score that is a combination of a symphony and a cacophony?
Yes, it is. You see, otherwise it would be too static. It's got to break down so that it can be rebuilt again. Otherwise it would be static.
Which brings up that question which I've never even begun to understand of evil. What is evil? Is it is it the cacophony within the symphony?
Yes, I suppose that from the time that, you see, supposing that you had a chance of creating a universe, imagine that you had, you just made things go the way, in an ideal way. There wouldn't be much gain by it. You already had that in your mind. But imagine that you create a universe in such a way that the beings in that universe were endowed with a certain amount of latitude in their free will. In that case, something constructive could come out of it, something that you had not yourself quite foreseen. And sometimes it's rather scary because you'd create this universe, now it's going differently to what you thought, and it might run amok totally. You know, I think you find that in some science fiction films, like setting something, the ball rolling and not knowing exactly where it's going. Now, fortunately, I think that we use the word God, I say the overall will has a way of winning in the end. In fact, at least that's written in the Zoroastrian tradition, that the devil, well, the saying that, popular saying, the devil, if you give the devil a long enough rope, he'll hang himself, that has a Zoroastrian origin. It's like there's a certain amount of time in which the forces of evil have enough leeway to act in a destructive way, but somehow their scope is limited. And you know that, of course, there was a time when people were very afraid of recombinant DNA because they thought that in no time the whole of humanity could be wiped out by a virus that couldn't be controlled. But we know now that nature has a way of countering any new organism by creating a counter-organism that would destroy it. There would be a battle and there would probably be a lot of damage done. And the same is true of a nuclear war. People are afraid that the whole of humanity will be wiped out and so on. But somehow nature has a way of surviving, of overcoming the misdeeds of evil ultimately. The control is ultimately in God's hand, let's put it that way.
But it could take a very, very long time.
A long time, and there might be, the extent of the damage can be enormous, of course.
Do you think we're still in a danger point in our development?
Well, I think we're right in a danger point.
Right now, just now.
But I don't think that one should, there's any point in making prophecies.
Yeah.
For the same reason that I've been talking about, since the divine will is a composite one and includes the wills of the individuals, we have a part to play in the way things are going to turn. My father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, when he was asked, what do you understand by the message of our time? He kept on speaking about the message in our time. And he said, it is the awakening of humanity to the divinity in man. Now, he didn't say the awakening of the individuals, because, you know, in all the traditions of the East, whether it is the Hindu or the Buddhist or the Sufi, what is at stake is awakening. That's what they're talking about, awakening. Awakening from the vantage point is awakening from a perspective. But Hazrat Inayat Khan was talking about a tidal wave of social, at a social scale, of awakening of mankind, or humanity is a better word. And what is it an awakening to? He says, it's not an awakening beyond the beyond into a samadhi state. No, it's an awakening to the divinity of man. In other words, the divine inheritance of man. And that is the thing that is questioned. I remember walking in back streets of New York, where often you hear people screaming and knifing each other, ambulances and police and so on, and drugged people and so on, and you think, well, what a terrible thing that humanity should have reached this point of deprivation. But if you go into the souls of those people, you realize that actually they've been hurt. They've been hurt, they're committing a kind of moral suicide, let's say, because they feel they've been deceived. They feel that people have been talking about God and talking about goodness, and those very people are deceiving them and doing things just for their own good. They feel that they perhaps, and not only they've been deceived by people, they feel that there's a defiance against their own intuition of a meaningfulness in life. Somehow you can lose your faith in the meaningfulness of life. And I think that is what's happening everywhere. And so the only counter to that is a resurgence of, I don't say belief in God. I think it goes beyond that. It's a realization of the meaningfulness of life. Mm-hmm. We have to, our problems are different from that of our forefathers. We're much more realistic, we're much harder than we were before, than our ancestors were. And I think that what people want is not to be told so much as to experience.
Yes, yes, and that for me brings up the why I no longer, or at a certain point, stopped going to church and finding that a valuable experience, because I was being told about God rather than being allowed to experience, as though there had to be a mediator.
Yes. But that's not only true of the churches, it's true of many of the ashrams and the teachings of the East and so on, which are still, some of them are right back into the past. I must say that, of course, there's some value in importing things that have proven to be valuable in the past. The spiritual heritage of humanity is extremely valuable in our time, but that's not where things are at our time. So it has some value, exactly as it has some value to visit Notre Dame or to listen to music of the past, but we are trying to find a new way. And people sense that. They have a kind of intuition of that. And the new way is different in the sense that people have to participate much more in themselves. They can't just be passive listeners or manipulated or be asked to believe in this or that or the other thing. And so what we have to do is to provide people with the wherewithal whereby they can have experience themselves. And the fact is that people don't quite realize it, that they have closed the door to experience of, let's say, an ineffable nature.
Of ecstasy, yes?
Yes, because they feel that they've been deceived by those who tried to convince them. Now they don't want to hear of it anymore.
Yes.
And so we have to overcome that reticence of people before we can give them anything at all. But you see, the only thing that really matters is the real person, much more than the teaching. What people want is like they've lost their belief in their ideal. And if they come across a person who manifests something of their ideal, well, they've got the living proof of it. And that's irresistible. And that person doesn't even have to speak, but just be.
I was going to ask you about music. You mentioned Bach before, and Mozart and Beethoven. They seem to, I don't know how you would explain it. Do they hear angel song? What is it about? How does music come through people like that?
I know. I've been trying to find that out for a long time. Getting into the consciousness, especially of Bach, which is very close to me. It's like, have you ever heard of, perhaps you've read that book called Cymatics?
No.
By, what's his name, Jennings, I think. It's like the way that the water flows in a river, or the eddies are formed when the river, there's a curve in the river, or the way that the bark of the tree is patterned, the way the trees interlate with one another in forming a kind of ensemble. It is all simply governed by kind of laws of cosmic harmony, which I think is what, of course, Pythagoras calls the symphony of the spheres, and which I call the order behind the universe. But we must, as soon as one uses the word order, people think of a static order, where it's dynamic, it's continually changing and flowing, and yet somehow behind it all there's a great, well, let's say there's a harmony that fluctuates from a rest point. I'm using the scientific terms here. I'll give you an example in music. For example, Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, if he were just to observe a static kind of harmony, and you find that in some of his chorales, well, then you have dissonance and then chords and a resolution of the dissonance and so on. It's, well, rather static. But then sometimes he moves away from that facile harmony into discords that get resolved, but in a subtle way. Let's say sometimes two themes that don't mesh completely, but occasionally they mesh, they intermesh, and then they depart. So there's a certain amount of freedom, and yet behind it all there's a kind of deep sense of harmony, of meaningfulness behind the whole thing. And you find that in art too, like in the ancients were caught in a very stylized art, like the Japanese sometimes. And now in our time we feel the need to free ourselves from too much constraint, but sometimes we can't deal with all that freedom, and so it becomes chaotic. But when, if a composer is able to use that freedom and yet, let's say, implement the harmony of the universe, while all is being inventive and creative, then of course his contribution is extremely inspiring to people because it gives them a sense of freedom and a sense that they can find harmony in their freedom.
Harmony in their freedom, yes. So that's also on a societal level what we're trying to work out too, then, isn't it? It's finding harmony in our freedom, working for individual freedom and on a social level.
Yes. It's, you see, it's the, as we said, each fraction of the whole limiting his own prospects or propensities or individual will, let's just say, incentive for the well-being of the whole, and yet still expressing what he has to express, and even sometimes expressing the harmony of the whole in his individual whatever contribution. And I think that is what you're doing, and that what a lot of artists are doing, and what a lot of other people are doing in life.
Yes.
That is creativity.
Yes.
Well, I'm always very happy to see that my intuitions confirm themselves, and I understand that you have been working with healing, and I'd be very interested in finding out what was your experience in healing.
Well, of course, I was studying to play a healer more than to become a healer. So my experience was I had a little taste of it. I studied with Joy, who's a medical doctor turned healer and teacher of healers, and he taught me to turn on my hands so that I could feel the subtle body. I worked with a few patients. He introduced me to a woman named Rosalind Bruyere, who's a healer in California, and she had me work with some of her patients, and I could actually feel the energies, feel where they were trapped, and she taught me how to run energy into a particular area of the body and to channel it. I try and be very careful when I talk about healing, because I don't ever want to give the impression that I do healing, because there are so many people with illnesses that write to me and ask me to heal them, and of course I can't do that because I'm not practiced, and just because I can feel the energies doesn't mean I can heal.
Yes.
I've always considered theater a healing art,
yes.
and that in a way what happens when theater really occurs is that there is a healing that goes on in the audience of some sort.
Yes.
I was very, very excited by being able to, I guess it's like we believe what we can see with our eyes and
yes.
believe what we
yes.
can feel with our hands, and when I could really feel the subtle body, it became much more real to me than
yes.
it ever had in all of the lectures
yes.
I'd heard
yes.
about it. Several of the healers I worked with said, you could really be a healer if you wanted
yes.
to, but
I
said, I'm not sure I'm ready to give up acting yet
yes.
to concentrate on that.
A lot of dedication.
Yes.
Well, of course, our policy is to, let's say, supplement medical therapy with healing, so that at no time should one ever interfere with the medical aspect. But there are some doctors, we're living at a time when some doctors are interested in alternate methods of healing, and I would say the best situation is where a doctor calls upon a healer to work with him yes. or her, because I feel that healers may be wonderful instruments of power, but are not always aware of the type of energy that is coming through, depending upon the illness or the state of the patient, and it's possible that more dense kind of energy could not be assimilated by a patient. Some patients would only respond to, it's just like a blood transfusion, a certain type of blood instead of another. And the other thing that I'm very concerned about is that most of the healing that is done is with energy, as you call it. It's all energy, of course, transference of energy. Magnetism, let's say, of an electromagnetic nature, I don't say that it's reduced to that, but that's one aspect of it. And as I say, this kind of energy, as we know, differs in its frequency and in its amperage and all kinds of things. You know that each cell of the body has its own particular electric potential, and so if you just hit the right potential, if you're sensitive enough, and that's probably what you've been doing, then of course it's helpful. Otherwise you can sort of overstress the area, and that's what happens in some case of healing. The other thing is that I think new perspectives are being opened in our time, and maybe we're a little in advance in our time by announcing that in the future healing will be done much more by means of light than by magnetism, by radiation. Now, you know, in the tradition, the old tradition, Merlin is supposed to have healed people with crystals. The crystal is a very special form of matter. Matter has reached an orderliness which is not to be found in most forms of matter. You know that the crystal, of course, absorbs the lights of different frequencies and radiates this light in a new way. For example, you can infuse certain crystals with ultraviolet light, and they will radiate blue light or red light or something like that. So they are giving out their own energy. Of course, they're absorbing energy, but they're transmuting that energy. And this is, of course, a lost art, knowing which crystals to place on which part of the body and how to get the electrons in the crystal into an excited state. And this lost art has been revived nowadays in the new techniques that are being used behind the Iron Curtain in Russia, and they are not accepted yet in the West, but I understand that there are some doctors who are using them in Canada, and that is using laser beams of very low amperage, of course, which is light, of course, coherent light, passing through a crystal on acupuncture points. Now, this is, of course, therapy, and it's not within my sphere, but I would have thought that rather than using an artifice of that kind, one could use one's own aura, because the body itself is like a very complex crystal, what they call aphasic liquid crystal. That's what the cells of the body are like. And so they are able to absorb the light of the environment and radiate it out in their own specific way. And so there's a whole art which we don't know very much about. But there are healers who work simply with the aura, and particularly with the third eye. And the third eye, the particular radiance of the third eye is more within the violet and ultraviolet band, and that's why I think there's some relevance in the violet flame. Now, I'm not talking about the organizations called Violet Flame, but that whole tradition that is being revived now and will be revived more and more.
Now, is the color of the light important?
Of course. Perhaps you know that in recent research that's been made in the Presbyterian Medical Center in Columbia University, Dr. Piller and many others, Dr. Becker and so on, have been cataloging the particular, let's say, specific frequency of each cell of the body. And by injecting the, let's say, plugging into, let's say, the signature tune of the cells, that's what it is, you can dialogue with the cells and you can influence them, for example, cancer cells or the T cells, in order to activate them, in order to fight the cancer cells and so on. It's a totally new perspective. It's opening up. It's
dialogue with the cells?
Well, in the sense that you produce well, in this case it's an electric current that has the frequency corresponding to the cells that the cell responds to, because it only responds to a specific frequency, because that's its own specific frequency.
It's language.
It's language.
Uh-huh.
It's music. It's music.
Oh, wow.
And so that, well, I would call that, of course, healing with music, with sound.
Uh-huh.
Now, the light has its frequency too. And so, for example, there's a certain frequency of red or blue or different nuance of red and blue. And so if you're able to find out just exactly the right frequency the cell reacts to, and if you're able to radiate your aura in such a way as to produce the frequency that corresponds to that which the body needs, the body of the patient needs, you're able to heal with light.
And using your own aura.
And nowadays there's a lot of research made on what they call bioluminescence, which is the particular radiance of the body, and that's really what the aura is. Now that is, let's say, the physical aspect of light. Perhaps that's the aura, what is meant by the aura generally by most people is photon radiation, but which is a purely physical phenomenon. But behind that, let's say, as reality, there are several spheres of reality. There is what the ancients used to call the uncreated light, and that is what we meditate on, because I think that the next two steps in the future are awakening, we already talked about that, and illumination. And that's working with light, so that people become absolutely radiant. And there's a relationship between the, how can I say, the thought of light, or the imagining light, and the physical radiation of the body. And that's what's being studied, the effect of your thought upon the light radiation of the body. There's a lot of study being made on this subject at present, and that's what we're working with ourselves. It's like meditating on light, meditating on different colors of light, and you find that the different chakras of the body correspond with the rainbow, so that the lower chakras are more in the red, and then the heart is like a golden disc, like the sun, and the higher chakras are more in the violet and the blue, and at the top of the head it's a little bit like a diamond with all the different hues, the different colors, and so on. There's a fascinating practice in meditation.
I've always wanted to be able to see an aura, and I don't understand how you do that. How do you?
I'll tell you. We set our eyes at infinity. You know, you close your eyes and you imagine a tree at a distance, and then maybe a peak of mountain range, and then the moon, and then the stars. So your eyes adjust themselves to your mental representation, visualizations, and they adjust themselves, they're set at infinity. And then you open your eyes and you keep your eyes at infinity. It's very difficult because the objects force your eyes into focus. If you're able to keep your eyes at infinity, that's the first step. And in fact, one discovers extraordinary things. One discovers like the eternal face of people behind their physical face, and one begins to see the auras of people. And as soon as you focus your eyes back into the physical form, then of course you lose it. This is what the Sufis call seeing that which transpires behind that which appears.
I see.
I should imagine that this would be a wonderful technique that you could use on the screen.
I'll have to try that.
Yeah.
All right.
And the fact is that, of course, when you do that, the world that you discover is so beautiful that you get into a state of ecstasy. And I think that the greatest, as I said before, the greatest energy that you could ever give human beings is ecstasy. It's the greatest gift you can give them.
How do you come back to the physical then after being out in that ecstasy?
Well, the body has its ecstasy too, of course. It's ecstasy on every level, of course, but there's a whole range. One goes from the more personal to the impersonal, and the wider the range, the greater, the more impersonal, the more intense the emotion.
The more impersonal, the more intense the emotion.
It's the cosmic emotion behind the universe, the emotion of the planets, and the emotion of a storm, and the emotion of the plants, and and beyond that, the divine emotion that manifests as plants. For example, a tree must experience some emotion and must have some consciousness. But if you imagine, and I've talked about getting into consciousness of a tree or the emotion of a tree, but imagine that you get into the consciousness or the emotion that has become the tree, of which the tree is just the expression. That's meditation. That's what I understand by meditation. And from the moment that one has been touched upon by that ecstasy, one can never be the same. One is just so moved by the meaningfulness behind life. Isn't it a pity that people miss out on that? I think that's the next step for evolution. In evolution.
How do we take part in that?
Well, I think that people are only too glad to be liberated from their prisons. You know, there was a saying of a Sufi who said, "Oh man, if you only knew that you're free, it's your ignorance of your freedom that is your captivity." And people are enclosed, first of all, in the appearance of the environment. They're really prisoners of the environment. People are enclosed in the illusion of their personality, of their self-image. They're enclosed in the confinement of their opinion and their assessment of situations. Like, for example, I'm sure that it must have happened to you to have wished for something 10 years ago and now to be very glad that it never happened.
Yes.
Or to be very sorry that it did, which means that at that time you saw things in a certain way. You were caught in a certain perspective. And for me, of course, liberation is liberation from a perspective. And awakening is awakening from a perspective. So if one can show people how they're caught, how they can be caught, and teach them how to watch themselves being caught, and they learn not to let themselves be caught anymore. They start escaping from their prison. That's the way to freedom.
I want to tell you a story, and then there's a question. In about 1971, I went to New York after being at Chamonix with you, and I was staying in a hotel room on Central Park South, which has the most beautiful view of Central Park in New York. And I spent the evening with a friend who was suffering very greatly and spiritually. And you were coming to New York and you were going to give a talk. And I asked him to come and see you, and he was closed. He couldn't, he had left the church and he didn't want to hear anything about spiritual leaders or religion or God or any of that. And we, all through dinner, I tried to convince him to come and hear you speak. I think it was the following night. And I went home exhausted and I went to bed and thinking about him and how I failed and why couldn't I get him to come and hear you speak. And then I went to sleep, and in my dream you appeared. And I said, "Oh, Pir Vilayat, I'm so glad to see you. I need your help. I'm trying to convince my friend to come hear you speak, and I wasn't able to convince him. Would you tell me the right words to say to him to convince him?" And you opened your mouth to speak, and I woke up. And outside my window there was a glorious sunrise. And I went to the window and I opened the window, and the sky was bright red, and the sun was glistening in the windows beside the park, and the whole world was rosy and pink. It was the most beautiful sunrise I'd ever seen. And I watched it for a while, and then I went back to sleep. And when I went to sleep, you were standing there. And I said, "Oh, Pir Vilayat, I'm so sorry. That was so rude. I asked you a question, and then before you could answer, I woke up. But there was the most beautiful sunrise I ever saw. Forgive me. Now, what is your answer? What should I tell him?" And you said, "Well, tell him what just happened."
Yes, that's the answer.
So, now, did you do that or did I do that? What happened there?
I'm not conscious of having done so. I'm very glad to have the credit of it. But a curious thing is this, and that is that one of the breakthroughs or the peak experiences of my life was in Chamonix, when I went up higher up in the mountains and experienced the dawn. The sky was pink and green and violet and brown and, well, just the most incredible colors. And there was the disk of the sun emerging gloriously out of that curtain of various hues. And I was so entranced by the whole thing. And all of a sudden I said, well, this is my real home. And not only that, but this is my real being. And after that, I remember descending from the high mountains and continuing the camp. It was a break in the camp. I don't remember exactly what it was. And something had happened to me. And I said, you know, to become what you are, you have to discover yourself in another being, and it could be the sun, that is more able to manifest what you are than you've been able to manifest so far. And in saying this, I was confirming something that I had experienced in the Himalayas when I went to visit a rishi when I was a very young man, and I was walking through the snow and ice, and you know, it's very dangerous. There are bears that hug you to death. And there I came across this rishi who was sitting in a cave, and it's a long story, I'll make it short. He said, why have you come so far in order to see what you should be? And now when I think it over, I was very young then, and I didn't have my wits about me as I might have now. And now when I think it over, I realize that the answer was, in order to become what I am, I had to see myself in another myself who was more able to manifest what I am than I have been able to so far. And so human beings are always in search of themselves, and their way of finding themselves is to look for another themselves, and in other words, a wonderful person. And that's that ideal that I was talking about. But as a reality, you know, when Jalaluddin Rumi, who was a great Sufi, saw this same dervish that I talk about, Shams Tabriz, who transformed his life, he said afterwards, the one whom I have always worshipped, I saw coming to me today in the form of man. If there is anywhere where one can find God, it is in man. And that's why some of the Sufis say, why do you look for God up there? He is here. Now, I think that we're cutting here into the very problem of the human being. The main problem of the human being is one's sense of one's personal assessment of oneself. A lot of people suffer from a sense of inadequacy, terrible despair. And it's because, as I said, they have lost faith in the ideal image which their intuition had told them about, where I said we're born with this sense of perfection, but they have not seen it anywhere manifest, and they've lost hope in it, confidence in it. Now, I think that, of course, you know, in the tradition that I represent, one goes and seeks, as I did, for a rishi somewhere, a being who develops powers that nobody could possibly develop, living in the way people live in life, in the usual way. But there's another way, because everybody can't go to the Himalayas, and there are less and less rishis remaining, or dervishes, for that matter. But the way to do it is to somehow project an image of human perfection. That's I would say it's the best meditation that I know. You could imagine, if you like, that you're going to the Himalayas and you meet that perfect master, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a master, just a perfect being. And then you begin to see the earmarked qualities in him, like tremendous power, majesty, sovereignty, insight, radiance, compassion, all those qualities, purity, truthfulness, all those things that we would like to see in a human being. And every time that you earmark a particular quality, you become aware of that in you. Like you see the power in him, and all of a sudden you become aware that you also have it in you. and you see his light, and you realize that you're also luminous, and so on. And finally you realize that you don't have to sit in the presence of that being, because you have all those qualities in you. And when you flash back upon the whole experience, you realize that all that you were doing was projecting your real being. And most people don't have the courage to be what they really are. And so you have to be able to project it. It's like that story of Surawadi, a great Sufi, who said that in a state of reverie, he was walking in the landscape of the soul, and there was this wonderful being who was coming towards him, and he was so overwhelmed by the beauty and the majesty of that being. And the more he got closer to, and he was advancing, that being was advancing, and the closer he got to that being, the more he realized that, in fact, he bears some resemblance with that being. He couldn't believe, how could I be anything like that being? And the closer he got, the more he realized that, in fact, this is his real being. Mm-hmm. That's the ultimate experience.
Yeah.
Discovering what one really is, and one wouldn't have ever believed it. And that's something that I'm experiencing all the time when I look at, when I'm giving these talks, leading meditation, looking at people with this glance that I talked about, like set at infinity, and my consciousness set at infinity. And I begin to see the eternal faces of people, and there's so much beauty in people, and I think if only people knew how beautiful they are. And then I realize that maybe I can serve as a mirror. Because I see that beauty, maybe people can see themselves reflected in my being. And then it becomes a wonderful experience of communion, the most transforming experience there is.
Thank you. Thank you.